in the depths of the forest at night. Every step you take might awaken something slumbering, and the sound of leaves being crushed underfoot might be a warning that you are not alone here. The story I'm about to tell today is an incident that happened when the protagonist of the story was compelled to join a nighttime trekking trip for certain reasons that left him no choice but to do so. And of course, that particular trip was ominous from the very beginning, signaling that they were destined to encounter horrifying events. This is the story titled Night Trip in the Forest. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. For today, we delve into the eerie experience of Paul, an event he encountered firsthand. To recount this story, I must take you back to around the year 2003. At that time, Paul was working at a financial institution, and in addition, he worked as a freelance photographer. One Friday afternoon during the period of this incident, Paul received a call from a magazine editor. The editor wanted to hire him to take photographs and write a story about the activities of a certain group. Before ending the call, the editor provided Paul with the contact information of someone named Beer for further details about the assignment. Based on the initial information Paul received, Beer was the administrator of a website called Night Trip. The site organized adventure trips, including moonlit forest treks, rappelling down mysterious waterfalls, and similar outdoor activities. At that time, rappelling was considered a popular outdoor adventure, and the mysterious waterfall in question was a newly discovered location, meaning there wasn't much information about it available. Paul contacted Beer, and they arranged to meet at a gas station in the city center at 6 p.m. to set off for the nighttime forest trek. Beer emphasized to Paul to bring several flashlights. Hearing this, Paul felt uneasy. Even trekking during the day was challenging for him, and now he had to venture into the forest at night. He was torn, debating whether to withdraw from the assignment. After much deliberation, he decided to proceed, not wanting to damage his reputation by backing out. That evening, he arrived at the meeting point around 7 p.m., intending to possibly skip the trek altogether. When he arrived, Paul called Beer, assuming Beer had already left. But to his surprise, Beer answered and said, "Hey, I'm standing right here," waving to Paul from in front of a restaurant. Paul smiled awkwardly and crossed the street to meet him. Inside the restaurant, a group of men and women were dining, their table filled with alcoholic drinks. They were engaged in lively conversations, as if they were there to party rather than embark on a nighttime forest trek. Beer led Paul to the table, gesturing for him to sit, saying, "Come sit down. Rest a bit before we head out." Not wanting to appear rude, Paul complied. Beer then introduced the group, which consisted of 3 men and 2 women. Paul referred to them by their online aliases. The first woman was named Fern, the second, Nan, who was the group's secretary. The 2 men were named Ted and Leo. Including Paul, the group comprised 6 people. They ate and drank until around 9 p.m. before setting off, with Beer as the driver. Once the vehicle started moving, everyone fell asleep, only to be jolted awake by Beer shouting, "We're here." Paul groggily woke up to find it was past 11 p.m. the surroundings pitch black, making it impossible to discern their location. Beer instructed everyone to get out and prepare their gear, adding that once ready, they should gather at the meeting point. He shone his flashlight at the designated spot. Everyone then dispersed to use the restroom. When they regrouped, Beer explained that they would need to hike uphill to reach the campsite, and another group had already gone ahead of them. Leo was designated as the group leader. Leo explained to everyone that the trail would take them along the edge of a waterfall's cliff. He warned them to walk heel to toe, following the exact footsteps of the person in front. A single misstep could result in falling into the ravine. Leo further cautioned the group to watch out for sprained ankles from the rocks around the waterfall. To ensure a safe journey, he said they must first pay respects to the spirits of the forest. After this, Leo turned around, flashlight on his head, and asked Ted, "Where's the white liquor?" Everyone turned to Ted, and Paul was startled to see Ted's enormous bag, stuffed with items unlike anyone else's. As Ted fumbled around looking for the liquor, his bag accidentally snagged on something, causing a loud cracking sound. When Paul shone his flashlight in Ted's direction, his heart sank. Ted's bag had knocked over the small legs of a wooden spirit shrine, causing its offerings to scatter all over the ground. Beer turned and yelled at Ted, "You clumsy idiot, Ted!" Ted, flustered, stammered, "It's dark. I didn't see it." Beer instructed everyone to pick up the scattered items and place them back on the shrine. He then used his rappelling rope to fix the broken leg of the shrine, tying it so it could stand upright again, albeit slightly crooked. After repairing it, Beer clasped his hands in a gesture of respect, vowing, "If we return safely tomorrow, we'll come back and fix this properly." Paul, Nan, and Fern helped gather the scattered items and rearrange them on the shrine. As Paul was picking up the items, he noticed Nan unintentionally stepping on something, pressing it into the wet ground. When Paul picked it up, he realized it was a traditional Thai dancer figurine. He brushed off the dirt and placed it back on the shrine. Throughout this, Paul couldn't shake the thought, what horrifying events might await us tonight? After everything was set in place, Leo poured white liquor into a glass, lit a cigarette he had brought, placed it on the shrine, and lit incense. He then made a statement asking for permission to enter the forest that night and for protection so everyone could travel safely. Everyone followed suit and bowed to the shrine, except for Ted, who went as far as lying down flat on the ground in a full prostration. Leo reiterated to everyone, "Once we're in the forest, I won't repeat myself. I must emphasize, do not comment on anything you see or hear carelessly. Do not speak disrespectfully while in the forest. Let me tell you, the supernatural is real. If you encounter anything unusual, don't react or comment. Keep it to yourself until we're out of the forest or reach the campsite." The atmosphere grew noticeably tense as the group began their trek into the forest, with Leo leading the way, followed by Fern, Nan, Paul, Ted, and Beer taking up the rear. Not long after entering, a light drizzle began. To make matters worse, it was indeed a moonless night, as anticipated. There was no moonlight or starlight visible in the sky. The hike involved following the person in front closely. When they ducked, everyone ducked. After emerging from the woods briefly, They waded through water before re-entering the forest. This cycle repeated several times. Perhaps due to exhaustion or something else, Paul began to hear the rhythmic sound of drumming from the top of the mountain, as if a festival was being held. He almost blurted out a question to the others several times. The drumbeats seemed to resonate with his heartbeat, creating an eerie synchronization. After some time, the rain subsided, but the forest air became stiflingly hot and humid, making it hard to breathe. Worse still, the humidity caused the flashlights to malfunction intermittently. The path became steeper, as if they were heading toward the source of a stream. The slippery, muddy terrain made it even more challenging to walk, especially for Paul, who was carrying a large camera bag. The higher they climbed, the louder and clearer the drum beats grew. As everyone trudged forward in silence, Leo, at the front, shouted over the roar of the waterfall, "Hey, we're almost at the waterfall. Walk slowly and follow the trail closely. Don't spread out too much. On your right is a cliff. Be careful." Paul shone his flashlight to the right, only to find impenetrable darkness. The void seemed to suggest that the cliff was at least 50 to 80 meters deep. The group continued for nearly an hour, but Paul felt like they were walking in circles. Eventually, Leo exclaimed, puzzled, "What's blocking us? Why are we circling back to the same spot for almost 2 hours now?" He ordered the group to stop, saying he and Beer would scout ahead. According to him, it should have taken less than an hour to reach the campsite, but it had been nearly 2 hours with no sign of it. Something was definitely wrong. While waiting for Leo and Beer, the remaining 4 members sat on rocks along the path. After a while, they heard the sound of footsteps splashing in the water. The sound was startlingly loud, as if the being making it was enormous. Couldn't have been Leo and Beer because the noise was coming from the downstream direction they had already passed. The footfalls became more frequent and faster, as though the creature was now running toward them. Paul distinctly remembered that the path they had taken was littered with rocks, making it nearly impossible to run. From the sound, it also seemed unlikely that it was just 2 people. It had to be more. As the thudding footsteps grew closer, the 4 looked at each other in alarm, wondering what to do. Before anyone could say a word, Nan, who had been silent the entire trek, suddenly whispered, "Elephant." The moment she said it, she took off running. Instinctively, the rest of the group followed, running for their lives. At that moment, Paul, Ted, and Fern ran closely along the stream to their left, while Nan broke away from the group, running to the right. Ted noticed and shouted, "Warning, that way leads to a cliff." However, before Ted could finish his sentence, everyone saw, with their own eyes, Nan and the beam of her flashlight suddenly plunge into the darkness on the right-hand side, vanishing rapidly. The remaining group members stood in stunned silence at what had just occurred. Amid the shock, Paul noticed a large tree, wide enough to require 3 people to encircle it. He instructed everyone to run and take shelter behind the tree, reasoning that if the elephant came closer, they could climb up to safety. While hiding, Fern spoke up, her voice trembling with panic. "I remember seeing this tree far away from the riverbank earlier, but now why is it right next to the bank? And when we first entered the forest with Leo, we passed by this tree several times. I remember it clearly because of the red cloth tied around it." After finishing her statement, Fern reached out to touch the red cloth tied to the tree, showing it to the others. As the group whispered among themselves, they suddenly heard the sound of someone walking toward them. They immediately crouched down and fell silent. A voice broke through the tension. It was Beer calling out, "Hey, where did you all go?" Relieved, the group emerged from hiding and explained what had happened to Beer. They started discussing how to find Nan. Before any decisions could be made, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. When they turned around, they saw Nan walking toward them, her body covered in mud. Everyone hurried to ask her what had happened. Nan didn't respond but simply shook her head slightly, signaling that she wasn't seriously hurt. Nan joined the group just as Paul's flashlight inadvertently shone on her face. Before he could make out any details, Nan quickly raised her hand to cover her face and turned away. However, Paul noticed her eyes appeared red and swollen, resembling symptoms of conjunctivitis. Paul assumed this was due to dirty water from her fall causing irritation and didn't think much of it. As the group expressed their relief that Nan seemed unharmed, Leo called out from another part of the forest, "I found the way out. Follow me quickly." His flashlight beam was visible from the direction of the stream source. The group reunited and began following Leo into the forest. Ted, feeling relieved, quipped, "Who the hell decided to hold a concert up here in the mountains?" This prompted Paul to listen carefully again. Sure enough, the sound resembled an actual concert. This confirmed Paul's earlier suspicion that the others had also heard the strange drumming. Ted continued jokingly, "Once we get up there, I'm gonna check out the show, find a girl, and see if I can score a companion for the night." Paul silently wondered why Ted would joke about something like this. Shortly after, Fern chimed in, "I smell sesame oil, and I can hear a xylophone too." Beer tried to lighten the mood by suggesting, maybe the villagers up there hired a traditional band for some offering ritual. There might even be food waiting for us when we get there. Ted sarcastically replied, "It's almost 3 a.m. now. Who on earth would be playing a xylophone and cooking for us at this hour?" As the group continued walking, Leo, leading the way, confessed, "I didn't want to say anything earlier, but I've been hearing the drumming since we entered the forest. I just didn't want to freak you guys out." Paul noticed the trail becoming increasingly steep, leading them to scramble over small rocks. Before long, they arrived at their destination. The campsite consisted of a small wooden pavilion, divided into rooms that could sleep 2 people each. However, the structure resembled a storage shed more than a proper lodging. Surrounding the pavilion were 2 or 3 tents, presumably left by another group that had arrived earlier. Paul observed that one of the tents was tilted on its side, as if improperly set up without pegs. A large tarp was spread in front of the wooden pavilion, strewn with scattered bottles of liquor and unwashed dishes. Paul speculated that the earlier group must have indulged in a heavy night of drinking and feasting. Beer dismissed the scene with a casual comment, "Don't mind any of that. Let's just split up and rest for now. We can figure everything out tomorrow morning." Paul and the group dispersed to find places to rest. The dawn was only a few hours away, and with exhaustion weighing heavily on him from the long trek, Paul simply rolled himself into a mat and lay down in front of the wooden pavilion. His spot was on the uppermost flat area, allowing him to look down and see Ted sleeping directly at his feet. As Paul began to drift off, his body aching with fatigue, Faint sounds of music and drumming started to reach his ears. The sounds grew clearer, accompanied by rhythmic cries like a call to arms. The noise was unsettling, making it impossible for Paul to sleep. Then came a sound that sent shivers down his spine. The heavy, deliberate steps of someone walking at his feet. Paul grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the source. What he saw froze him in place. It was Nan. She had risen to her feet and was now performing an intricate dance. With her bare heels, she stomped on the mat that Ted was using to cover himself. Nan's movements were graceful, like those of a professional dancer, but every time her foot struck the mat, Ted groaned in pain. Instead of moving away, Ted curled into himself as if paralyzed. Ted's cries woke the rest of the group. Beer, who appeared more level-headed than the others, rushed to pull Ted away from the mat. However, at that moment, the mysterious drumming grew louder again, and Nan began to dance toward Paul. He found himself unable to move, as if under a spell. Just as she neared him, Leo and Fern intervened, grabbing Nan by the arms to stop her. But to everyone's shock, the petite and slender Nan easily broke free with a forceful twist of her body. She turned and resumed her dance toward the wooden pavilion, stomping on plates and dishes scattered on the ground. Strangely, her feet showed no signs of cuts or injuries, despite the broken shards of glass beneath them. Without warning, Nan walked into one of the small rooms inside the pavilion. The group stood frozen, unsure of what to do. From inside the room, the sound of stomping feet echoed ominously. Moments later, people began fleeing the room in panic, far more than the room could have physically held. These individuals, terrified and barefoot, ran across the broken glass, crying out in pain as blood stained the tarp beneath them. Paul and the others quickly rushed to help the injured. Fortunately, the wounds weren't severe, but the sight of blood-soaked ground added to the eeriness of the night. As the bleeding subsided, the drumming and music abruptly ceased. Ted, meanwhile, remained unconscious. Concerned about Nan, Beer suggested that some of the group go into the pavilion to look for her. However, one of the men from the other group who had emerged earlier stopped them. "Don't go in there," he warned. "That's not Nan in the room. It's someone else." A woman in traditional dance attire. Taking stock of the situation, Beer decided to only take Paul and Leo with him to investigate. The three of them entered the room cautiously, flashlights in hand. To their shock, the room was completely empty. There wasn't a trace of Nan or anyone else. Mystified, they returned to the group and spent some time calling out for Nan, but there was no sign of her. Finally, Beer suggested waiting until daylight to resume the search. A young man from the earlier group advised them to wait for Uncle Pete, a local guide who was expected to arrive with breakfast in the morning. The group agreed, gathering together to talk as no one dared to go back to sleep. In their conversation, Paul learned that the other group had arrived at the campsite the previous evening. They had spent the night drinking, singing, and making merry until around 1 or 2 a.m. Suddenly, they heard the sound of drums and a xylophone, along with strange laughter. The noises were so unusual that they stopped singing and listened intently. Soon, they heard a more chilling sound, the synchronized stomping of many feet growing louder and closer. Panic set in, and they scattered, seeking refuge in the small room within the pavilion. While hiding, they heard footsteps circling the pavilion. Then, a woman dressed in traditional dance attire entered the room. Terrified, they fled the room, resulting in the earlier chaotic scene. Paul and the others sat in tense silence, waiting for dawn. When Uncle Pete finally arrived with breakfast, he immediately noticed the blood on the tarp. Upon hearing about the night's events, he remarked, "I forgot to mention, it was a holy day last night. People around here often experience strange things on such nights. And last night was a new moon, which makes it even more intense. I told you to stay at the lower camp until morning, but since no one listened, I went down to sleep there myself." After some discussion, Uncle Pete instructed his team to treat the injured while another group went to search for Nan near the spot where she was last seen. Uncle Pete, Paul, and Leo decided to explore the area above the waterfall, suspecting that Nan might have gone in that direction. Paul noted that the path to the waterfall was narrow and flanked by sheer cliffs. He couldn't help but think that trekking at night had its benefits. During the day, seeing the steep drops might have made him too terrified to move forward. For the path leading up to the summit, there appeared to be two main trails. The left path was overgrown, covered with grass and vegetation, while the right path was clearer, suggesting it was frequently used. At the entrance to the right path, there was a small shrine with a corrugated metal roof built over a termite mound. When we asked Uncle Pete if this was the way to the waterfall, he said it wasn't. He pointed out that the path to the waterfall was actually on the left. Uncle Pete then went to pick up a wooden sign that had fallen over and muttered to himself about putting it back up. Leo, seeing this, went to help Uncle Pete replant the sign. While they were occupied, Paul took the opportunity to explore the shrine. Upon closer inspection, he noticed offerings placed inside. Beneath the shrine, instead of a termite mound, there was a laterite stone about the size of a monk's alms bowl. Seeing this, Paul prepared to clasp his hands together in prayer, asking for the sacred entity's guidance in helping them find Nan quickly. As Paul closed his eyes and silently prayed, he suddenly heard someone calling, young man, young man." Startled, he opened his eyes and looked behind the shrine. About 100 meters away, under the shade of a tree on a slope, two men were standing. What surprised Paul the most was how their voices had sounded so close to his ear, even though they were far away. The men spoke in an old-fashioned dialect, saying, "We found this woman wandering in the forest and brought her here. Please take her." As soon as they finished speaking, Nan appeared, carrying her backpack, looking confused as she emerged from the slope. Seeing Nan, Paul shouted her name, drawing the attention of Uncle Pete and Leo, who rushed over. Together, they joyfully called out to her. Meanwhile, the two mysterious men turned and walked back into the forest. Paul informed Uncle Pete and Leo about the men who had brought Nan. Once they were reunited, Paul gently asked Nan how she had ended up there. Nan explained that she didn't know exactly what had happened. She remembered running away from a wild elephant and falling into a whirlpool. Luckily, her backpack got caught on some rocks, which allowed her to pull herself out of the water. Exhausted, she had fallen asleep by the shore. When she woke up, two men approached her and asked if she was hungry. She said yes, and one of them handed her a lotus leaf containing food. Inside was simple rice mixed with sesame oil, but it tasted incredibly delicious. After just a couple of bites, she felt her strength returning. Nan also mentioned that she had to cross 2 hills before finally finding them. Upon hearing Nan's story, Uncle Pete immediately knelt to the shrine and bowed, then turned to Paul and Leo, saying, "We must pack up and leave this forest." The group agreed without objection. Once everyone made it safely down the mountain, Beer suggested they repair the shrine as they had promised earlier, as a gesture of gratitude for their safe return. However, when they returned to the shrine, they were all stunned. The shrine appeared perfectly intact, with no signs of damage or wear. Beer, puzzled, said, "I was the one who tied my rope to the shrine's legs. How could it have disappeared?" Shortly after, Fern discovered the missing rope tied to the roots of a tree nearby. That tree had a red cloth wrapped around it, and at its base were offerings of liquor and cigarettes they had left the night before. Nearby were small dancer figurines arranged neatly in a row. The sight left everyone speechless. Despite their confusion, they prioritized getting the injured to the village for treatment. While waiting, Paul had a chance to speak with the village elders, who told him an intriguing story. About 5 or 6 years ago, a wandering monk had meditated on the summit of the mountain. He told the locals who visited him that the laterite stone beneath the shrine was one of 4 ancient boundary markers enchanted over 1,000 years ago. During those times of frequent war, the markers were created to shield the city from visibility and protect its inhabitants. The monk explained that each marker housed a guardian spirit. To respect these entities, the villagers had built shrines over the stones to serve as a warning to locals and outsiders not to trespass beyond the markers. The elders further recounted that decades ago, the boundary marker was found at the base of the mountain without any shrine. Strangely, it later relocated to the summit on its own, and no one could explain how. In the past, there was a widely publicized case that made headlines. It involved a group of bandits who robbed a gold shop in the city and fled into this forest to evade capture. Ultimately, they couldn't escape and were shot dead by the police at the site. 5 corpses in total, near a large tree with a red cloth tied around it. The story goes that those who die in that area cannot reincarnate. Their spirits are bound by ancient spells, forever trapped. Every night, these souls are said to relive their deaths, running down to the same spot and dying over and over, endlessly repeating the cycle as part of their karmic punishment. At the time, someone once asked a wandering monk if finding all 4 boundary markers could release these spirits. The monk replied that it would be very difficult since the locations of the other 3 markers were unknown. Only someone with great merit or exceptional knowledge could hope to find them. The monk explained that the person who cast the spells on the markers had passed away and could not undo them. Thus, if a marker was found, it should be carefully protected. Losing it would make it nearly impossible to retrieve again. In the present day, the corrugated roof shrine and the laterite stone mentioned in this story are no longer there. All that remains is the mysterious music, which still plays on every holy day, echoing through the area. As for me, this story kept me on edge the entire time, wondering how it would end. At first, I thought Nan might have died after falling into the ravine, and that the ghost of the dancer had taken her form to deceive everyone. It is truly fortunate that no loss of life occurred on this trip. What do you think of this story? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support us as we continue to share spine-chilling tales. If you're someone who enjoys eerie experiences and chilling stories, Let us be part of delivering that haunting experience to you.